Brian Darcy James is an Independent Spirit Award nominee for his work on The Cathedral. I'm David Buchanan with Gold Derby. Brian, first and foremost, congratulations on the nomination. Just tell us about, hearing the news for the recognition for this work.
Thank you. I was very, very surprised, and just completely flabbergasted. Just because I've been there before, I know what the Independent Spirit Awards are about. And the last time I was there was with Spotlight, so that was my introduction to that ceremony and how that organization recognizes independent filmmakers and filmmaking. And for this film to have been recognized in that way, for myself and also for Ricky D'Ambrose, who is the writer-director, for Best Feature, the John Cassavetes Award nomination, and also his editing of the film. It's just a tremendous gift to the film in the sense that it allows me and Ricky and others to talk about the film so people can see it, which I think is one of the great benefits of having the light shine upon independent filmmaking.
Absolutely, no question. And let's get into the film, because I feel like this is such a unique film in terms of the way the narrative unfolds, the way the storytelling is put together. So talk to me about, how did you kind of approach building a performance that's kind of in vignettes? It's such an interesting kind of slice of life film with, scenes and narration. So how did you kind of find the character in, these kind of small moments throughout, the course of a child's lifetime?
That's a good question, because it is a very unique film. And there's a couple ways to answer that question. The first, which is that the fact that it's an semi-autobiographical film. So I'm portraying a version of Ricky's father and events in his life. So there was the attempt, or the challenge, or the goal of having to kind of get a sense of his family, get a sense of his father, but not necessarily have to be beholden to an imitation thereof, but just understand what it is that Ricky was drawing from. Not only the people, but the era and the time. I grew up in the '80s, so that wasn't a stretch for me. It was I know that era, but certainly not as an adult, looking back and having some of the the challenges that a patriarch would have, trying to make his way in the world. So that was the first thing. And then secondly, when I read it, I remember thinking, oh, this is interesting, because the kind of the narrative starts off with not much chance for you to get to know the characters in their own world, in their own sense or own expression. But as the story progresses, and Ricky may not agree with this, but this is how I felt, is that as the story progresses, you get more time to kind of see the characters come to life. There's more space for the scenes. There's just more of a sense of who they are, living and breathing, which is a little bit of a counterbalance to the aesthetic of having a very kind of staid narrative, perhaps, for lack of a better word, not in the pejorative sense, but just kind of a clinical look at this, a removed look at this family. So to answer your question, I think zeroing in on those scenes where the character felt most alive and had most to express was a way of kind of understanding some of the earlier scenes when you're kind of getting a sense of him through maybe more of a distant point of view.
Yeah, I agree entirely with what you're saying about the structure of the film and how we meet and learn about the characters. And I wanted to ask you, kind of in that front half of the film, what I first noticed about your performance is really the body language in those first few scenes that we meet your character, just the way that you carry yourself as Richard. So talk to us about, was there anything in particular you were trying to convey with, how he stands and how he sits? Because it really, your physicality of the performance really struck me.
Thank you. There wasn't anything in particular that I was trying to achieve, through that physicality, but perhaps just the thinking of this person, this man who has a lot to prove, is always a little bit behind, and always wants to be 3 steps ahead, and having a sense of having to perhaps kind of hustle or try to live beyond his means, not only in the financial sense, but also in the kind of emotional, intellectual sense, and just his way of living and trying to compete with the world. I feel like he was the biggest competitor with himself. This kid, the way that Ricky drew this character. So in that sense, there's a lot of internal kind of drama, struggle going on with him just right out of the gate. So perhaps that's what you were seeing, but that was definitely what I was thinking in terms of a person who was just always wanted to have maybe a better shoe to wear, a fancier shoe or a softer sweater, or something that looked a little bit better than perhaps what he had. Um, so just a little bit out of his skin, perhaps, is a better way of putting it.
Yeah, that's great. Something else we learn about your character very early on, it's right in the opening of the film, is the death of his brother, and Jesse's uncle. I just wanted to ask, because it's such a kind of striking way to open the film. How much do you think that loss, and that fear kind of affects Richard throughout his life? Because obviously it's a theme in the film as parents die and whatnot, but that seems like such an important way to begin the film. What did you take away from that to kind of inform, the character, moving on through the years of his life?
Well, I think the most revealing aspect of that, which I think you're right, it is a huge shadow that's cast upon him and his family. This is a man who loves his family dearly and immensely, and I think is at a loss with dealing with any kind of death or any kind of loss in his life. Not equipped perhaps to kind of deal with it in a way that would allow him to move forward in a healthy manner. It's always a challenge to do that. I've experienced that, many of us have. But I think, as going back to the first part of my answer, the most revealing aspect is later on when Jesse, Richard's son, is kind of innocently inquiring about his father and how he died. And he can't even attribute it to AIDS. He can't even, he kind of misnames the diagnosis. He blames it on infected silverware at a restaurant. I mean, there's just a denial of understanding or wanting to understand what exactly was going on in his brother's life. So I think that is a huge revealing component of not only this character, but also a sign of the times, of people not understanding, living in fear, wanting to not accept exactly what was going on, and just dealing with the problem. I mean, for crying out loud, the 80s was, the Reagan years were infamous for not even allowing the word AIDS to be uttered from a political platform sense, or a policy sense, rather. So I think those two kinds of things, the kind of political framework that Ricky uses throughout the film, through kind of cultural signposts, AIDS being one of the AIDS epidemic being one of them, as represented by the death of Richard's brother, that those kinds of political things inform and work in tandem with the character in this sense.
Yeah, no question. Something else I mentioned earlier, the film is a real slice of life look. We get all these lovely vignettes of different milestones, as you said, and important moments in Jesse's life and in his parents' life and whatnot. How much, I was just wondering, like the birthday scene when Jesse's, 2 or 3 and the family's gathered around singing happy birthday. I mean, it's such a kind of emblematic and recognizable moment in life. How much of your own, existence as a father, were you kind of living through again, kind of going through these major milestones in a child's life, like a second birthday or graduation? How did that resonance feel, and did you bring any of your own memories to set when you were, kind of reenacting some of those moments?
I think subconsciously I probably did, just only in the sense that I think as a father, birthdays and milestone events for your child is also an indicator of what you're able to do for your child, whether it's in, how many gifts you give them or however you want to define it. In this case, I think Richard probably would want, my character would probably want to see, just an immense amount of goods for his son to experience materially. And that would be an indicator of him being a good father, perhaps, along with the genuine love that he feels for his son. But I think those kinds of moments are definitely reflecting moments for a parent to see, not only time passing and seeing your child kind of move into a new phase and ultimately out the door, in the best sense of going out into the world, So it's always kind of a bittersweet moment. And I do think that Richard probably sees these things as much as milestones for himself as he does for his son.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to talk about some of the later scenes in the film now. So if you haven't watched the film and you don't want to know any spoilers, pause the interview, go seek it out, and then come back and hear kind of the discussion of the second half. But one of, I think, the most striking scenes for your performance is when Richard delivers the eulogy for his mother and really struggles to find words. And I think, the character up to that point, as you're saying, we learn more and more as it goes, but he really is a character of very few. He's very kind of minimally spoken. I think we don't hear him kind of, give monologues and say much. So just, I wanted to ask you about that moment, trying to convey all of that emotion when you don't actually have words to utter. Again, kind of going back to the physicality, because it's such a heartbreaking moment and scene that you perform. And he really just is kind of speechless to respond to the death of his mother.
I think it's indicative of this character's inability to feel, or actually him feeling dwarfed by the world, and not able to kind of compete with the world in a way that he feels that he's doing a worthy job of being alive and present and effective in the world. Um, that's a baseline, I think, for him. And with the death of his mother, like I say, I feel like this character and this family loves each other deeply, but they just have a hard time finding their ways to kind of be cohesive. I think that scene represents just immense the immense challenge of him trying to understand the world in which he's living, understand the emotions that are kind of boiling within him. And that happens in a couple of other scenes as well, where his emotions get the best of him and he can't help himself because he just is always trying to get a sense of how he should operate in the world. And I think he always feels flat footed. And the result of that feeling, I think, often comes out as combat or as just kind of a paralysis, perhaps, of expression of emotion. That happens too, I think, generally speaking, throughout with the relationship with his son. How that love and that connection is communicated is constantly challenged, I think, by his own ideas of how he functions in the world.
Yeah, that's exactly what I wanted to ask you next, his kind of combative nature, because you have another great scene at the graduation party when the family is kind of leaving and Richard feels overlooked by his former in-laws and kind of has an outburst. Just talk to us about finding that kind of more volatile part of the character. And what is it about? Because the relationship with the in-laws is always so interesting over the course of the film. It's not smooth. So just
No,
talk about that relationship and finding that really kind of climactic. That's really the climax of your performance in some ways. So just talk to us about that scene.
well, I think there's always a constant competition of evaluating. Again, that's the word I keep coming back to. His own self analysis of how he's doing in terms of um, taking care of, providing for, supporting his son and his wife, what he can give them, what he can't give them. And I think when he feels like he's being outdone, or if there's a way that someone does it with more grace or with more ease or with more generosity, that is a complete affront to him, because it's just a reflection of his own inability to compete in that way. I'm hedging on the words, uh, incomplete or inability, because in a way I don't want to diminish the character, because he's dealing with the cards that he has, and I think that's where the drama comes, because his feelings of his feelings of less than um, are the things that kind of are the first things to light up on his radar. So when he feels like he's not being appreciated or he's not being recognized for his contribution, it's easy for him to kind of throw everything out the window for the sake of the respect that he feels that he deserves. I think other people might be offended if they didn't feel that way, but might not go to the lengths that he does in order to demand that he's recognized. And that's constantly what he's trying to do in this world. He just needs to be seen. And ironically, that's exactly, well, my feeling is that that's what Jesse, the protagonist of the film, is desiring as well. And so therein lies this interesting relationship that informs both of these people. One, a grown adult man, and the other, a child, working his way and growing into adulthood. So that's really a beautiful thing, the way that Ricky has devised that relationship, and the consequences for Jesse, and how you see it play out, how that dynamic plays out for him, and where he goes in his life to find a means of expression through his art, through his photography, through his kind of clinical observing eye. So it's just a fascinating way of telling a family story.
Let's talk about photography too, because one of the last shots of Richard we get is that kind of photograph moment after Jesse says, I think he read a letter in which he writes that, hasn't been happy in his life. Richard has kind of, put that on paper. And we get a photograph that's very kind of evocative of the headshots of Jesse that we've been seeing over time. It's a great kind of still and kind of one of the final images for you. What was going through your head when you were shooting that moment? What are the thoughts, the kind of last ruminations you were having as Richard?
Well, I mean, to be totally honest, I don't remember shooting that particular scene. So I'll be a little bit more macro with my answer. Of course, I remember the story plot, the story point rather, and I feel like, again, it's, the filmmaker Ricky gets to use the aesthetic of how he's going to use, how he's going to insert something that is still like a photograph, or a documentary footage of an historical event to kind of coexist with another kind of narrative. So I'm not necessarily thinking about how that's going to play in that sense, but when I'm creating it, I think the short answer is, it goes back to all the things I've been discussing before. It's just his sense of trying to. I think the heroic thing about Richard is that he has a sliver or enough of a sense of himself to see the things that he's missing, and the things that he needs to work on, that he can recognize that, and but not necessarily employ those characteristics to kind of move forward in a way, and as you say, for him to be happy or not. So I think there's a certain kind of pathos in that, in that he recognizes the things that he wants to achieve, he wants to be, but is also honest enough to say, what, I didn't do that, and I'm not happy because of it. So I think there's great pathos in that. Yeah, that's the word. It just is. It's heartbreaking because this guy wants to be everything to his family, and he just seems like he's he just needs to find things for himself so he can function in the world. And you got to love yourself before you love others. And I think that's his challenge.
And before I let you go, Brian, I want to ask you about your other role that you're currently starring in right now, Into the Woods on Broadway as the baker. Fabulous role in a Sondheim musical, and congratulate you on the Grammy nomination for the cast recording. I just want to ask,
my total goal here is to win a Grammy in February and then win an Independent Spirit Award in March.
Well, congratulations on the nomination. I just wanted to ask you about how poignant it is to be playing the role of the baker and grappling with fatherhood and loss, at around the 1-year anniversary of losing Steve, and in this production that's really in his honor. Just talk about doing this role at this moment in time.
Well, all of that is true. So to start with, yes, you're right. It is. We're constantly very aware of the presence of the great Stephen Sondheim and his absence on the scene. But by virtue of his great work, 2 posters of which are right behind you, that's never going to go away. So that's the miracle of it all, and we're all better for it. For me personally, I played this part 20 years ago, and I was not a father then. And I can't tell you the number of times I've been doing this show where I think, oh, this is about this. I had, two arrows in my quiver. Now I've got 100, in terms of the experience that helps in telling the story. And I think that's the beautiful thing about this story is not only as a parent, but just as a human being, there's constantly there are constant moments for me, and I think for others, I think it's safe for me to speak for others to say that there are new revelations about what is being communicated and what kind of epiphanies you can have about loving and losing and growing and sharing and taking all the qualities of being human being are represented in this story in such a unique, fun way. So all of which to say is that I feel really lucky to revisit this and do it with such an extraordinary group of actors and an extraordinary orchestra. And the way that this music sounds and the way that it's presented is so upfront and unadorned in a way that allows it to be heard and I think experienced in a way that is very clear and I think consequently very successful.
Absolutely. Brian, congratulations on both roles on the Cathedral, and enjoy your final weeks in Into the Woods. And thank you so much for talking to Gold Derby today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.